Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Cynics. We're going to maybe lighten up a little bit here, and a lot. We've been talking about apocalypse. I don't know how much darker you can go. I guess you could, but that's pretty dark. But we thought this might, maybe it would be good. Let's say this. We've kind of discussed this, and we want anyone who wants to listen to the podcast, obviously, but I want to focus more on reaching the younger generations and doing a little more intergenerational discussion on here. And I think that hopefully for anybody listening, that'll also be helpful. So we thought maybe we'd start by doing a little foray into understanding the different generations. So I'm just going to start with baby boomers. I don't know if we still have a few of the greatest generation folks left. But they're probably...
My grandparents are greatest generation. They're still around.
Are they in their 90s yet?
Yeah, they're 90. Okay.
So, there are some of those folks left. I would just say, if your grandpa, great-grandmother or somebody still around, just get to know them. I doubt that they're going to really worry about elections and politics too much. They might, but we want to kind of start with baby boomers and understand, say, baby boomers, Gen X, then millennials and Gen Z by looking at, try to illustrate through music and film, because these would be ways that people from different generations can look at what kind of best helps them understand the way the other generations think. And so we're going to focus on music today and start with that. And I'm not going to start into the 50s. I'm trying to remember when baby boomers, if it was 45 to 65, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so I'm not really going to focus on the 50s. You could have some of the oldest baby boomers that maybe were about, 15 or a little older by the time of, 1960. But I just want to kind of start with the 60s. This is where there really started becoming more, a lot of social change. I think this is where there ended up being changes proposed and implemented and protests and a lot of polarization that kind of got started. In the 60s, early on, and even I think late 50s, you had your beatnik generation. Yep. I think they kind of paid homage to that in Friends, didn't they? Was it... which one was it? Phoebe? They went to that coffee shop and then, the beatniks, they would do poetry and then everybody snapped their fingers.
Right. Yeah.
So they kind of brought that back, but that was an old late 50s kind of thing. And, but that kind of segued into the hippie movement. The hippie movement, countercultural. So it's the way you dress, you wear clothes that were much different, loud colors. Guys let their hair grow long, which was not really accepted by mainstream society. But what are some of the songs? So I could talk about, the British invasion, the Beatles and all that. I don't know that really impacted culture or would kind of help you understand. Other than okay, well, I like this song, I don't like this song. But in terms of understanding what was going through people's minds and what kind of issues were at hand. Okay, you had the Vietnam War. Okay, that was the big thing. And it was because we still had the draft. I think the U.S. didn't do away with the draft officially till 72, 73, somewhere in there. But there were a lot of young men. I'm not sure if they drafted women then, but there were young men that were drafted into the military and ended up dying in Vietnam. And a lot of younger people were protesting. They didn't want to be sent off to war for a cause that they didn't really believe in. They didn't really know it was really necessary to keep Vietnam from becoming communist. Okay, it wasn't apparent how that was somehow going, like that was worth thousands of American lives to prevent that from happening. So there was a lot of protest songs. So I think, to me, the song that kind of best captures the protest movement, to me, is "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah, that's sort of the classic protest
I mean,
song.
he just comes right out, and all these patriotic people, with the red, white, and blue, they'll point the can at you. It was kind of funny. I can't remember if it was Levi's or one of those companies, maybe about 10 to 15 years ago. They had an advertisement, and they only played the first part of that clip. Some people born to wave the flag, ooh, the red, white, and blue, and that's all they played. And it made it look like it was a big patriotic song. And it's like they're not playing. It's like, that ain't me. I ain't no senator's son. Yo. Anyway, but but that was the thing. I'm not a senator's son. I'm not a rich person's son. I was, some people born with a silver spoon in hand. But whenever the tax man comes, the house looks like a rummage sale. Like, the rich people keep getting richer, but they somehow manage to not have to pay any taxes. Okay? And even the Beatles came out with some of this, even though they were British and it was aimed at the British government. But like their song Taxman on their Revolver album. Have you ever heard that song?
Oh, yeah.
It's like if you get, it's like I'll tax your feet, or we'll even tax the air you breathe, and we'll find excuses to tax you for things. But "Fortunate Son," I think, was really the protest song. Okay. Then here's the thing. In the middle of all this, you had the protests, and then kind of a concomitant to this with the hippie movement was, hey, why don't we set the example for all the older adults by just showing them it's really simple. All you have to do is get together and love one another and just accept everybody and just love whom you please. Okay, so they had this, what was it, 1967, the Summer of Love. And they had this big gathering in San Francisco. And so the song "San Francisco" by Scott McKenzie, wear flowers in your hair. And it's just like, it's going to be great. And this really kind of captures where young idealism. So here you have protests against just kind of what I would say rogue capitalism and United States warmongering, or let's put it this way, we're not necessarily warmongering, but I think the claim was we're sticking our noses in where it doesn't belong. We're finding excuses to get involved in wars. And that's why people started talking about the military-industrial complex. So
yeah, there's a lot of anti-imperialism.
Yeah, because
in those protests.
Well, yeah, see, because the protesters, their argument is United States finds excuses to go in and start, basically fight a war in some place where we haven't been invited, for some, under the guise of protecting democracy or something else or whatever. And then we go there, then we kill a bunch of people, we bomb things, we basically destroy as much infrastructure as possible. And then when all the fighting's over, then we have a chance to even send our own contractors and such in to rebuild the infrastructure that we destroyed. So then, because we have a military presence there, that also gives us an inroad to controlling commerce in that part of the world. And so it's kind of like a win-win. We get this political power. We get all this extra work. Well, we tax people to pay for weapons to be made, and then we tax people for the infrastructure to rebuild the places that we blow up. And then,
I think maybe a little bit of like a short history of Vietnam, would be beneficial, because Vietnam's relevant for my era that I'm going to tackle later.
Okay.
So at the end of World War II, the treaties that were signed guaranteed the countries that were involved in World War II self-governance.
Right.
However, in order to get the French on board with some of these treaties and the development of the United Nations, France wanted to maintain some of its imperial holdings in the South Pacific.
Right.
Which included Vietnam.
Right. That's right.
The South Vietnamese people started to persecute the North Vietnamese over religious differences, there started to be a sort of like people's movement amongst the North Vietnamese that was going to overthrow essentially the French colonial government.
Right.
And that's when the French couldn't win that war on their own, the United States stepped in, and then we essentially lost that war.
Yes.
But in the process, like, a lot of the lyrics, I think, of these songs are very specific about what was going on. So, like, the use of napalm is famously associated with Vietnam.
Yeah. Right.
Even though it was developed at the end of World War II, which napalm is like gasoline that has had certain additives mixed in with it to make it like jelly-like, so that it sticks to surfaces while it burns. And it's very chemically toxic. So anywhere that napalm was used is just like salted earth. You can't grow anything there. It's all toxic ground. So like James Taylor's song, I've Seen Fire and I've Seen Rain, he's talking about napalm in that song.
Yes. Yeah. So, there was a lot. I'm trying to remember. That's not the same thing as Agent Orange, is it?
No, it's different. But
Agent
they were both
Orange
used.
was like a chemical.
Yeah, it's a chemical that famously causes birth defects in those exposed to it.
Oh yeah, okay. It was an herbicide that they used on people. That's right. So I remember there being a lot of talk about Agent Orange whenever I was a kid. But yeah, napalm, that was another one. So it's like, and the younger people, so, and this became part of it. Okay. So it reminds me to a great extent, okay, of the Colin Kaepernick thing. So like a lot of these hippies were, I can't speak for all the hippies. From what you observe and read and see, it wasn't like all these people were America haters. They were basically opposing the government. Now, I've never been one to agree with burning flags and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's any. I don't know. To me, that kind of is in the same ballpark as an effigy. But that's me, and maybe that's because I'm a borderline Gen X baby boomer. I don't know, but I'm not convinced that like all these hippies or like Colin Kaepernick was intentionally being unpatriotic or disrespectful. So if you love your country and you feel it's going down the wrong path, now I think it's fair to say, okay, Colin Kaepernick should make a protest, but maybe during the Star Spangled Banner is not the place to do it. Okay, that's fair enough. But then don't roast the guy. unless it's pretty obvious he intended to be disrespectful. I mean,
well, he's not the first famous person to use the Star Spangled Banner as protest music.
No, and that goes back to, was it the 68 or 72 Olympics with, I don't know if you remember this, but the three Americans who won the gold, silver, and bronze, I can't remember if it was track. They, when they played the Star Spangled Banner, at the medal ceremony, they all gave the Black Power symbol with the raised fist. Did you ever see that picture?
No, I've never seen that. But that's very interesting.
You need to see that. Yeah, it's almost kind of, it kind of reminds me, to me, it's kind of iconic, like a civil rights version of Iwo Jima. They're all three got their arms up with the Black Power, civil rights protest. That's why I think it was 68. I think 68 was in Mexico City, if I'm not mistaken. 72, I think, was in Berlin, and that's when there was Jewish Israeli athletes were killed there, if I'm not mistaken. But that was Munich, not Berlin, Munich. I think it was Munich, Germany. I'm trying to remember. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean, the protest stuff, so a lot of people felt that, okay, this is disrespectful. So, and then you had also kind of odd reactions. So whenever soldiers would come home, sometimes they were jeered and spit on by the protesters, because for some of the protesters, I guess they figured that you should refuse to serve and get thrown in jail rather than go serve in the Army or the Marines or whatever during the war. And again, you had one side oversimplifying the protest as just unpatriotic, and then you had the protesters just oversimplifying the people who answered the draft and went and served their terms as somehow selling out to the man or whatever. And you have a bunch of people just getting angry at each other. I mean, you see why, I've mentioned before, why a lot of this stuff that's going on, it's almost like it's almost like the 1960s coming back again, to a certain extent. We have these two growing, we have the protesters. We have, for example, we have the liberals who don't want to vote for Biden because they're protesting the whole establishment. And then you have, on the other side, also protesting the establishment. So they go with a person who's about as non-establishment as you can get, which is Trump. But Trump is more established.
Trump has become.
I think Trump is more establishment than what they recognize. But I think that was his appeal, because he said, "Oh, I'm independently wealthy, so I don't have to answer to all these folks, and we'll drain the swamp and blah 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 blah." And that won a lot of people over. And I'm not here to discuss Trump, but what I'm saying is, this is so for some of these folks that were baby boomers and went through this generation. There's some of these same dynamics, and it's the same type of thing where people who aren't satisfied with the way things are, and you have people saying we need to have equal rights. So in the 60s, it was black people, and then even some feminists, because there were certain places and jobs and opportunities that were not available to women. And even where women had opportunities, they weren't often paid what they were worth. And a lot of people were arguing, oh, this is going to destroy the fabric of the economy because women will be taking jobs away from other men, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We eventually, outlived that. Now, what's going to look like once we outlive this one? I don't know.
What I'm sort of hearing is like if you're characterizing the music of the 60s.
Yes.
The zeitgeist of it all, the like spirit of the times is protest. It's socially aware music.
It is a two-sided coin, in my opinion. Protest the bad, dream about the ideal. Mm-hmm. So the whole summer of love, free love, experiment with drugs. It's just like, hey, let's just cut loose.
What the Beatles were talking about.
Yes. And actually the Beatles were actually doing.
Right.
So the Beatles started dropping acid and doing stuff, trying to expand their creativity. And, oh my golly, like the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, this first concept album, and then they put all these famous people, like pictures of all these famous people on the cover.
Yeah.
It really was culturally interesting stuff. Because it really was a time of kind of turmoil. And so here it is. You have society. So baby boomers are the people that lived through one major cultural shift when they were younger. And it may be that now that they're older, they don't want to live through another one. I mean, maybe that's part of it. I'm not really sure. But here's the thing. I don't think like all these protesters were anti-patriotic. So, for example, listen to Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner at the beginning of Woodstock. I mean, it may be a little abstract for you, but I personally like it because he's trying to do the sounds of the bombs bursting in air and all this stuff. And but there's a sense of he's not just playing it. There's a sense where he's trying to do his best with the song.
Well, yeah, I think James Taylor's another good example of this. You have James Taylor writing the protest music, and then also James Taylor singing about how much he loves North Carolina.
Yes.
He's got 3 songs about North Carolina and how much he loves it.
Yeah. So, this is really part of it. It's like, gee whiz, there's parts, people look at different states, people look at different groups of people and say, some things about them I like and some things about them I really don't like. And, but can you have these dialogues? Can you have discussion, or do you just have a bunch of screaming and yelling and protesting at each other? And, well, anyway, so the protests, right, start getting out of hand, or at least let's put it this way. The mainstream public believes that the protests are getting out of hand and actually there are some riots and things. Mm-hmm. Well, then there's the overreaction where the National Guard comes in and shoots a couple students at Kent State. So then you end up with the Buffalo Springfield song For What It's Worth. And basically now it's like we're not even sure we can trust the police. So it's folks that are kind of wondering, like, is the whole fabric of society going to unravel here? Are we? Who can we trust?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I think that this is an appropriate time to bring up like Marvin Gaye.
Right.
He puts out What's Going On. He's famous for doing like romance music. He's sort of a sexual icon. But then he puts out this whole album that has none of his like what he's famous for on it. And it's addressing police brutality and generational poverty and stuff like that. And it comes out of nowhere, and it's a divisive album because he had a multiracial audience, and he sort of split that audience in that album. some of the reactions to it from the white community are very negative, even though now it's seen as like one of the greatest albums of all time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these songs, these albums, and this stuff got like a lot of radio playtime. A lot of people listened to the radio. You didn't have back in the 60s. There were no. There weren't even 8-track tapes. So you had vinyl albums, and then you had reel-to-reel tape players.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the big reel-to-reel, I can't remember like how many millimeter that is, but like the kind small versions of what they would use in recording studios. So basically you had a phonograph, you played your vinyl, you couldn't do it in the car. So everybody was listening. When people were out of the house, they had either portable radios or a radio in the car. Everybody was listening to everything on radio. And so there was a lot of control, even to a great extent, as to like what songs got what kind of airtime and play. So it even sometimes like some DJs would lose their jobs for playing certain songs or playing them too much or whatever. So there was all kinds of things going on here.
Yeah, it's interesting. The prevalence of radio, that'll be an interesting like comparison between how my generation listens to music. Because before radio, basically music was in the home. If you could play music, it was what you could play. But with radio and mass media sort of taking over the cultural landscape, you suddenly get these more like culturally interpretive pieces of art that become relevant to the interpretation of history. I think that's interesting because now we're moving away from that into more like individual listening through headphones, through streaming. That'll be an interesting comparison to make when we get to the more modern periods.
Yes. And I'm not going to spend too much more time in the 60s here. Because this whole fear of the breakdown, to me, I think a group that kind of captures some of that is the Doors. Not so much the whole group, but Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison wanted to be a poet, and he was a poet. But there was a certain point where it was really like, okay, you can't, like if you ever listen to their song Peace Frog, and there's blood in the streets, so it's like there's all this fighting going on, all rioting, and then the police come in and just shed more blood. They're not really helping. So there's this sense where society's breaking down, and it's like, I'm not saying they were advocating like anarchy and anything goes, but it seems to kind of head in that direction. So Jim Morrison is just kind of doing whatever he wants on stage. He exposes himself, I think, in Miami. That's what really ends everything for the Doors, because he gets arrested for indecent exposure, and then before they can put him on trial, he flees the country and goes to France, and then ends up dying there in France under weird circumstances. But their song "Light My Fire," there were a couple instances. So like, this is another thing. So if you want to understand older generations, you have to also, you younger folks, you need to be aware of this. And I've said this before. There was naturally a lot more groupthink with the older generations because everybody had limited access to to TV shows, to film. Like, you couldn't just downstream and watch things whenever you wanted to. It's like you had television, and it was only on at a certain time. There wasn't any technology to record it. You had to be there in front of your television set. And I've said that before. When I was a kid and Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, they were only going to be on once a year, and that's it. So when they announced after Thanksgiving when they were going to be on, I mean, you mark your calendar, and, unless you had a relative in the hospital or something, you were going to be there sitting in front of your TV watching it at the exact same time as all your other friends at school. Well, see, people all got their news from the same sources. Okay. They're watching the major network news. There weren't cable channels. And there were local newspapers, but even the national stories were coming through either Associated Press or United Press International, AP or UPI.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the two main sources. Later you had Reuters and others that came along. But these older generations were used to, so baby boomers definitely, and much of the Generation X generation also, everybody was exposed to everything at the same time. So everybody was processing pretty much the same thing. So now it's not surprising that with some of these older generations, they're still sitting down and they're all getting their news from the same source. That's what they kind of were conditioned to do. You find out which one you trust, and then everybody and all your friends, you all agree that we're trusting this same source, and then everybody is on the same page. That's how you feel good about what you think. You get your beliefs reinforced by everybody else. Now, the reason I bring up the Doors, because there was a show on that was live, and it was Ed Sullivan's. Mm-hmm. Ed Sullivan was he was like an entertainment critic from, I don't know if it's the New York Times or one of the New York newspapers, I believe. But he ended up having a show. In fact, Dave Letterman and now Stephen Colbert is in that theater where his show was. It was called the Ed Sullivan Theater. Now.
I think most people, at least of my generation, a little bit, not Zoomers. I don't know about if they would know the Ed Sullivan Show, but I know the Ed Sullivan Show.
Okay.
I've seen lots of episodes of it.
So Ed Sullivan, it was kind of like what Johnny Carson was then in the 70s and 80s, like the Tonight Show. So like for stand-up comedians, that was the thing. Like if you were going to make it, like if you could be invited on that show, you'd had a big audience, and then that was like the chance for your career to take off. So like all the music acts wanted to get on Ed Sullivan. Okay, the Ed Sullivan Show. But this show was broadcast live. So because it was broadcast live, their censors would sometimes want to censor the rock stars and change certain words or whatever. So even like in the
famously successful tactic.
Yes, so like in the late 50s, when they put Elvis Presley on the first time, he didn't sing Hound Dog the first time. They had him back on, then they actually had like a basset hound or something, and then they add him singing "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog" to a basset hound. But the first time they had him on, he's got his guitar, and Elvis was famous for gyrating his hips and doing all this stuff on stage, and it was just so risque. And the women, the girls would all scream and everything, and they'd scream after the Beatles and everything. But when they put Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, the cameramen were instructed to only show Elvis from the waist up, because it was too risque. They were not going to show him gyrating his hips and moving his legs around and stuff like that, because that was too vulgar. When they had the Doors on, and then also this, I think, happened with the Rolling Stones. The Doors were on there to sing "Light My Fire," the short version, of course. Well, the one line says, "'Cause girl, we can't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire." Mm-hmm. They wanted to change the word "higher" to something else. And they said, okay, and then went out on live TV, and he sang it anyway. And they said, you're never going to do Ed Sullivan again. And he said, well, we just did Ed Sullivan. So anyway, same thing happened with the Rolling Stones. They sang let's spend the night together. They wanted him to change it, let's spend some time together. And they refused. They did the same thing, if I'm remembering right. But they wanted
some people cite the Doors as the first punk band. Like they invented the genre of punk, and there's a long, I don't know if that's like all that accurate, but there's a long tradition of punk bands not censoring themselves after being asked to.
Yes.
It's sort of a rite of passage, and if you don't do it, you will lose your fans.
So, this is kind of what's going on. And so now, and here's the thing, you got this rebellion that's kind of brewing beneath the surface because trust in the social structures is starting to break down. Does sound familiar with the race riots after the George Floyd and all this other stuff? And then you still had some of the hippies holding on, but we're gonna, just set a good example, usher in peace, and but then the Manson murders took place, and Manson claimed that he was getting secret messages from the Beatles in the song "Helter Skelter."
Right.
Now that was probably just a bunch of malarkey that he was using, but nevertheless, here's the thing. All these people in the Manson family were these kind of pie-eyed young people that, we're just living in a commune and everybody loves each other and everything's just so nicey nice. And then they find out there's been all these murders and stuff. And then, that all unravels. And then that was like the wake-up call. I think that was in 69, and then it went to trial in 70. And so it was like, that was the end of the 60s. That was the end of the dreaming about San Francisco and Woodstock, and we're going to basically build. It's like, okay, well, we're back to the real world. Now, how do we deal with this? Well, at this point, go ahead.
Yeah, quick note on the Manson trial. Happening concurrently with an LA race riot.
Yes.
Like literally because at the same time.
Well, he wanted to blame, he wanted the murders to get pinned on the Black Panthers or, black protest groups.
And, that would have been convenient for him because they were protesting police brutality.
Right.
But it got extremely violent in LA.
Well, that's why the ones he sent, they took some of the blood of the victims and like wrote pigs and stuff like that on like the refrigerator and on the walls and stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think they put Helter Skelter and Death to Pigs or something like that. I mean, anyway, there's this kind of loss of innocence, but not everybody gave up on this. So going into the 70s, okay, so get this kind of a contrast, okay? You have John Lennon. The Beatles end up breaking up after John Lennon got, I don't want to say mixed up. When he partnered up with Yoko Ono, okay? And then they split. Well, John Lennon in the early 70s recorded his song Imagine. So there's this still... Man, just imagine if we could really reach these ideals and have this kind of a world. And so still holding on to this kind of a dream. There's that kind of a song. Then at the same time, you got other groups now. Brownsville Station records like Smoking in the Boys' Room. It's like you got the other half of the like former hippies is like, okay, that's the way it goes. So, hey, do your own thing. Don't get caught.
Right.
Get out there. Just enjoy life. We're not going to change. So some of the hippies just pretty much gave up on changing society.
Well, there's another interesting like connection with the war on drugs started by Nixon.
Right.
And he specifically targets Latinos, blacks, and hippies with the war on drugs. And so all the hippies who are using marijuana and acid and all that stuff go from being like peace loving, like don't cause a stir, to punks in the 70s.
Right. Right. And maybe the drugs were keeping them calm. I don't know. It's
well, they're still using the drugs, but now they're just it's more counterculture because the government has started to crack down on it. It's a little bit harder of an image.
Yes. Yeah, so this is kind of how the 70s opens. And I still see this kind of like with the younger people and younger adults. The 60s was a time of, protesting the bad, but still kind of hoping for the ideal. And a lot of these folks gave up on hoping for the ideal. And so pragmatism kind of takes over. But you might say everybody's tired of fighting for this stuff. Now, the Civil Rights Act does pass, and so there are some changes made. Okay. But yet, even with the laws being changed, there are still people trying to find and work their way around the laws.
So, the Civil Rights Act gets passed, but it doesn't ever get enforced.
Yeah. So this is where my next song that I picked out was Southern Man by Neil Young, who's a Canadian, by the way. And the interesting thing was, from what I read, now, a couple of years later, Leonard Skinner came back with Sweet Home Alabama because they thought that Neil Young was, like, in other words, condemned the whole Confederacy for what only like a handful were doing.
Yes, of course.
So there again, now we're back to some of this. So here's the thing. So you can see some of these same kind of social dynamics. So here we are, baby boomers, and now even some of the younger Gen Xers like me are old enough to kind of know what's going on now. I'm in grade school. I'm observing all this with the teenagers and the adults and such. But now here's the question. You have people push, and like, for example, you even see some of this, and I know we're going to talk about film. Maybe we should do television too, because like All in the Family, like, tackled so many of these issues. But I just remember this one where, Lionel's always throwing back to Archie Bunker and catching him up in his words. Well, and Archie, I can't remember what the context was, but Archie was telling Lionel, so Lionel says, so what you're telling me, Mr. Bunker, is don't judge the whole group based on the actions of a few. And he's like, yes, that's exactly right. And he says, okay, let me see if I got that. Don't condemn a whole group for the actions of a few. And he keeps saying this over and over again, and of course the audience, laughs, they get the point. But this is kind of what's starting now. So it's like, all right, now, even with civil rights, okay, even at this point, music is still fairly segregated. All right, like, black people had their own music, like the white people had American Bandstand. The black people had Soul Train.
Yeah,
the better I watched show. That when I was a kid. Soul Train. That was up in Chicago, I believe.
I've seen lots of episodes of Soul Train. I've never once seen an episode of American Bandstand.
Well, you can see it on YouTube, but that was hosted by Dick Clark. The guy that used to do the New Year's Eve thing every year and did the $10,000 Pyramid TV game show in the 70s. But anyway, there was still this kind of segregation going on, because I remember even like some of the black singers like Roberta Flack. She got a lot of flack from the black community because her music was a little too white. Like The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face and some of these others. And they used to have, in fact, they would just refer to black music as soul music. Like I remember you go into like a jukebox and it would have songs and then the genre, and it was like soul or R&B, rhythm and blues. Those were like the two black categories. Like, I mean, that's the way it was when I was a kid. It really wasn't until this is why I think Michael Jackson Michael Jackson, I think, had as much impact on some of this as many, many other pop stars. I mean, people like listening to other people's music. I mean, because even going back into, I don't know if you've ever seen the, the Buddy Holly story, where even like Buddy Holly played in, what's that one auditorium that was traditionally just for the black kids to listen to their music in the 50s? The Apollo or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think it was the Apollo. But he played there and they were kind of surprised and liked his music. Just like then white people started listening to Chuck Berry. Okay. So there were others. Okay. But that really kind of never went beyond much of just simply, well, we like their music. But as far as, the races mixing, people weren't really open to that. But people were starting to mix and mingle, date, marry, etc. And again, the people that started bridging that gap, they got kind of shot at from both sides. Mm-hmm. Michael Jackson was one of these. Now, I know Michael Jackson had, I'm trying to remember the name of that condition where, yeah. And so, he had that, the claim was, he had to have those treatments to lighten his skin, keep it blended out. But there were a lot of white and black people that thought Michael Jackson's trying a little too hard to be white or look white. I really don't care, honestly. I gotta admit, when I was a young person, I was kind of jealous of his talent. I mean, he not only wrote, like sang, he wrote songs, and his dancing is like some of the stuff that he did, when he goes up on his toes, or like that lean over thing in Smooth Criminal.
Yeah, with the shoes that slot into the floor.
Yeah, still, even with that, Michael Jackson almost, I won't say he single-handedly created MTV, but I'm telling you, his music videos, especially like Thriller. Thriller was like you were watching a show, like set to music. It was almost like a musical, or what a rock opera should be. I mean, in the 70s, and I'm still kind of still doing the 70s here.
So we're talking off the wall Michael Jackson.
What's that again?
So we're talking off the wall Michael Jackson.
Oh,
his
off
first
the wall
solo album.
Oh, I was going to say, you had other rock operas like in the 70s, like with Tommy, the Pinball Wizard, with the Who, and then you had The Wall by Pink Floyd.
Pink Floyd, yeah.
Well, see, this was another part of it. So now they're starting to come to grips because you had, all right, so there's this cultural divide. Okay, so some people, the whole hippie movement, rock, and this kind of hippie rock, folk rock, like that was part of it as well. So you had the rock and roll, which was just kind of feel good, dance to music. And this is kind of what Don McLean's kind of capturing in American Pie, the day the music died. So like, like the heavy rock and rollers, Elvis gained too much weight. And so he basically just ended up just kind of singing ballads and, but singing in Las Vegas. Okay. So, and he was doing movies in the 60s, but you had, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper all died in a plane crash.
Yep.
In Iowa, I believe it was. But you this kind of, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard left and, went to singing gospel. And so like that kind was going. And then you had the British invasion. And so the Beatles started out with some of that, but then very quickly kind of moved on to being more experimental, and other groups too. So the music was more political. It was more like social commentary. And it had that purpose. There was like folk music mixed in with it, with the 60s. So you had Bob Dylan was a big influence, especially in the early, mid 60s. And then you had like Blowing in the Wind by Peter, Paul and Mary. And let's see, what was the other one about? About playing the flowers and how the flowers end up going to the widows of the soldiers that died and stuff. I'm trying to remember Where have all the flowers
gone? That's originally Pete Seeger.
Yeah, that one.
Pete Seeger is like the original protest music guy.
Yeah.
Like all the way back to like the 40s even.
Yeah.
Just him and a banjo. So, he got really popular during the Vietnam War though. I'm a huge Pete Seeger fan, so.
Okay. All right. Yes. So, by the mid 70s, I think people were just ready to cut loose and just go back to having fun again. And that's what they wanted to do. Kind of like what was going on in the 50s and early 60s. So disco, first funk, and then disco was kind of that kind of captured that. And so it was more back to, hey, we're just going to go out and dance, have a good time. If you want to go home with somebody, you go home with somebody. That's, you had like the whole disco thing. Celebration by Kool and the Gang is kind of captures that, or Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. And hey, you know what? Just surviving. You got to just survive, roll with the punches. But hey, now we're, and even Eddie Money, like where everybody's living for the weekend. We're gonna just hang in there during the week, and hey, we're going to have great weekends, and that's when we're going to really get to do our thing, and that's what life is going to be all about. And so they kind of developed this kind of pragmatic mindset that you just kind of stick your nose to the grind, do what you got to do through the week, and try to make it to the weekend. And I think a lot of the folks in the baby boomers and Gen X, I think largely still have a lot of that mentality. I mean, there were people like, say, from the 60s, that part of the baby boomers where, you go to college and you're going to major in, like European art history or something or whatever. It's not really about getting a job. It's about finding yourself and expanding your horizons. And
bold words from philosophy people, but yeah, go on.
Yes, that's right. But it starts shifting to, well, that's nice if you can afford it, but and that's another thing. The 70s brought a lot of inflation. There was, again, we started getting most of our oil from the Middle East, and then there was price gouging and other stuff when we had an energy crisis. And, I remember, as a kid, you could only go get gasoline like every other day, like based on whether your license plate ended in an even or odd number. And then you can only buy like $5 worth of gas at a time, something like that, to make sure everybody has enough to get back and forth to work and things like that. So anyway, that kind of gets reflected in the music, in the sense that the music is, it's not really about commentary much anymore. Until, as I remember, and this is where we're basically entering into my high school years now. And that is right at the end of the 70s, going into the 80s. Bohemian Rhapsody. That song kind of, everybody loved it just because it was musically so experimental and just so odd, unconventional. That might be the word I'm looking for. But if you listen to the words, the lyrics that at the beginning and at the end, it's like Freddie Mercury is like struggling with his sexuality and wishes he'd never been born. And so this is where, in my mind, I know there were other events that happened. So I'm not an expert on LGBTQ history. So don't misunderstand me. But I know there was stuff that happened like at that place in New York.
Stonewall.
And other... What's that?
Stonewall Inn.
Yeah, Stonewall Inn, that. Okay, that was in the late 60s?
Late 60s, yeah. The police tried to shut down a famous gay bar in New York, and the LGBTQ community rioted and stopped them from closing it. And that's sort of seen as the beginning of the LGBTQ movement.
Yes, I'm not arguing with that whatsoever. I just think that some of that was not really, that was apparent to people that lived in New York and in the big cities, I think.
Yeah, it's more posthumously that it's looked back on as like the beginning of it all.
I don't remember hearing about this until I was much older. But Bohemian Rhapsody was right there. Everybody knew who Queen was. They became famous by my cousin had the 45 with "We Are the Champions" on one side and "We Will Rock You" on the other side. That was the coolest 45 album, one of the coolest ever. For guys in junior high school, that was awesome. And so they were already famous. And I can't remember, I think it was after Bohemian Rhapsody that they ended up doing another one, Bites of Dust, and they just became really popular. But Bohemian Rhapsody really brought that whole issue out to the forefront. And yet people still weren't talking about it openly. But it was like everybody was thinking about it now.
Yeah, well, and I think it sort of it brought the AIDS crisis to the forefront of societal consciousness. That's exactly right.
Oh, okay. So this, oh my golly. Okay, so this really is a great transition for me going into the 80s now, because this was part of what was going on, is that you had people that were resisting these changes and these movements that wanted to see, I hesitate to say it, but I don't want to say they wanted to see people die of AIDS. There probably were some. I hate to say that. I don't think most wanted to see people die of AIDS, but I do think there was this prevalent mentality. It's like, well, see, that's what you get. And so like AIDS was like a curse from God to punish homosexuality.
Well, the AIDS crisis sort of concurred with the, what do they call that? The moral majority, the new religious right, with like the Reagan era and everything. And there are famous Christians who are still famous Christians today who said this is God's punishment for homosexuality. That wasn't even that uncommon.
Moral majority was started by Jerry Falwell in the 70s.
Yes. Yeah.
He's the guy that founded Liberty University.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That movement kind of fizzled out in the early 80s and then got replaced with the Christian Coalition, which was founded by Pat Robertson through his TV show, The 700 Club.
Right.
Okay. Now, here's the thing. A lot of the conservative Christians were, okay, so here's the thing. Let's go back to the 60s. So this is all in the background as well. So you have these hippies and the protesting. Well, then you had a number of these people that are experimenting with drugs and they die of accidental drug overdoses or, things like that. So you have Janis Joplin, you have Jimi Hendrix, and then you had like even an occasional suicide like Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what The Wall was about, was a tribute to him and then his struggle with dealing with how does he reconcile his private self with his public persona, and how
that's sort of what Wild Horses by Rolling Stones is about, is Mick Jagger's struggle with substance abuse.
Right.
Do you know about the concept of the 27 Club?
No.
So there's a surprisingly long list of famous musicians who die at the age of 27 because of mental health issues and substance abuse. Jimi Hendrix is in the 27 Club.
Yeah, okay. Now that does ring a bell. Yes.
Like it's
really
Jimi Hendrix, Nick Drake, well, not in this time period, but Kurt Cobain is 27 when he dies.
Right. He was Nirvana, right?
Yes. And he's going to be a big part of what we talk about in the 90s, because Nirvana is one of the most influential bands of all time. So,
yes. So there's this kind of, this extra indulgence, and see, this kind of proves that you guys are on the wrong path and you need to come back to the conventional, traditional ways of thinking. All right. In the late 70s and going into the 80s, there was some evangelical pastor in Ohio that started taking his albums and turning them backwards on his turntable.
Right. Yeah, the Satanic Panic.
And then whenever he heard stuff that resembled words, he was claiming that rock stars were intentionally putting stuff in so that young people will be getting these subliminal messages.
Yeah, wasn't the first one Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin?
Yes. Yeah, there's one place where he's singing, oh, there are two roads, but in the long run, something like that. Oh, there's something you can clap. Well, anyway, when you play it backwards, it sounds like, oh, it's my sweet Satan or something like that.
Yeah. That was actually a good impression of it.
So, some of this came out of, because in the 50s, like Coca-Cola would pay movie companies because film was shown like frame by frame,
right,
on these, and they would put occasional frames of like a
frame of an ad.
Yeah, like an ice cold Coke, with a thing of popcorn, and then everybody would see this subliminally and get hungry and go out and get snacks, and so then they outlawed that. But then, this guy was claiming that there was backward masking going on in rock music and this and that. Well, lo and behold, a group that starts on the rise in the late 70s is AC/DC from Australia. And when they first started recording, they got, as I recall, they got trashed by Rolling Stone magazine that this stuff is unlistenable. They absolutely hated them. But they started gaining a following in the United States. And little by little, and this group was kind of in your face. I mean, dirty deeds, and they're done dirt cheap, and and I'll be your backdoor man, and anyway, and then Angus Young out there dancing around in a Catholic schoolboy's outfit, and so then it kind of hit the pinnacle when they recorded their Highway to Hell album. And I think I've talked to you about this before, but they recorded their Highway to Hell album. And then they even had on the cover, Angus Young with horns on the front. Mm-hmm. And, I remember as a teenager from the church, I was even scared to touch the albums or you might get demon possessed or something. Some of this was started by, honestly, it was started by, I remember Alice Cooper was one that did some of this kind of quasi-satanic type stuff. And then Ozzy Osbourne. I think Sharon Osbourne, that was part of his gimmick, was doing all this really, because Black Sabbath kind of had that with putting 666 on like a tombstone on the album cover, and everybody was afraid that, you know, they were dabbling in the occult. And of course, the Beatles had dabbled in some occultic type stuff.
Well, there's Black Sabbath as well.
Yes.
Ozzy Osbourne and Ronnie James Dio both come out of Black Sabbath, and they sport the whole satanic vibe.
Well, yeah, the song Black Sabbath is about some guy that finds that he's going to be a sacrifice to Satan in this ritual. And but anyway, so Highway to Hell, it's a big smash hit. But then AC/DC's lead singer Bon Scott dies of alcohol poisoning. And then everybody's like, oh, see, it's just like all these other, you know, and there were people out there claiming that all these rock stars, that in order to be famous, they had to make pacts with with Satan.
Yeah, meet him at the crossroads. It's a tale as old as time.
Right. Or Faust. That was, one of the old operas. So anyway, make a deal with the devil. Well, everybody was looking for AC/DC to fall apart. The lead singer was gone. What do they do now? They get a new singer, and lo and behold, Back in Black comes out, and it's like, everybody thinks it's like the best album they ever done. It's like better than it was before. And so this was kind of like, I won't say this definitely was not like punk rock, but this feeling like, in your face, religious people, where, you know, yeah, he was too stupid and didn't control his alcohol intake, but that doesn't mean that, you know, we're all a bunch of raunchy people, yada, yada, yada. And so, see, because some of the music business was kind of going the way of like professional wrestling, like where you had to have some kind of like gimmick, to kind of draw. So we end up with like a Devo. Yeah. Okay. And they did like some like socially, like songs that kind of were socially conscious, but they also just did songs that were whatever, you know, like about sex or whatever, Whip It. And that was such a popular song, but it's like, okay, now people are at least start like the 60s. They wanted to talk about sex and do it freely, but it was kind of suppressed. Everybody, like, I think was doing sex in the 70s like they always have, but just nobody was talking about it. Now they start talking about it. So you end up with like Whip It. You have like Madonna later, like a Virgin. Madonna, again, pushing the boundaries. Like there's still like an element, like each generation. This is kind of like Gen Xers coming into their element and wanting to push back against, like each generation tends to want to make its mark and distinguish itself from its parents. At least it seems that way.
There's a trend in the music industry of like, once something becomes popular enough, it becomes an investable property, right? So bands that get a big enough following get signed to a label, and then they've sort of sold out. And then their style is then just like reproduced by record companies.
Right.
So I think that's where you get like these more revolutionary early, like heavy rock bands that then become like hair rock, like hair metal, which is just like way overproduced, all show, very little substance, but it sells well, and it's very polished.
You know what's funny though, is because some of the music, the black music that was popular, that was labeled soul and all that sort of thing, was more sexually overt. I'm not saying explicit, not like rap. Okay. But again, white people didn't pay enough attention to what black people were doing, that black people were able to push the envelope a lot further than white people did. Because,
yeah, well, you go back to Marvin Gaye, who's sexual healing in the 60s.
Well, did you ever, and this was based on even an older, I think, rhythm and blues song. Have you ever, I actually like this song, but have you ever listened to the song, Chuck Berry, I Want to Be Your Driver?
Yeah, but once again, it's been a long time.
Yeah. I want to be your driver, and I'll be ready when you want me to drive you downtown. and it's like, I've never had the pleasure of riding such a wonderful machine.
Yeah, very subtle.
But and like James Brown, like, so I've kind of collected some James Brown music as I've gotten older. But like in the early 70s, he was like, get on up like a sex machine. He's doing this. And even like some of their like riffs and chord patterns get used and like, what do they call that? Appropriated or whatever by other artists. So like,
right.
David Bowie, who did Fame, fame makes a man think things over. Well, that whole, the background music that was taken from James Brown. And just the same thing happens with, you have Super Freak with Rick James, and then along comes MC Hammer and takes the same music and then
that's part of hip hop.
Mega
the
star.
Sampling.
Well, and see, this is part of the whole thing. Say it's like you had the Sugar Hill Gang who did like some early rap type stuff, and everybody laughs about it, Holiday Inn, and
yeah,
kind of corny lyrics or whatever. But
have you ever
MC Hammer, his appeal was across the board.
Did you ever listen to that song really carefully? The Sugar Hill Gang. What's the name of that song? There's a line in there. It's
you mean Rapper's Delight?
Yeah, Rapper's Delight. If your girl starts acting up, then you take her friend.
Yes. Yeah, he does.
That lyric is amazing.
Yeah. Well, the one that cracks me up is like where he's like, you're eating at your friend's house and the food stinks and something tastes like wood and anyway, and so, and he says you got to run to the store and get a bottle of Kaopectate. So anyway, it's pretty funny stuff. But anyway, you see, and white people didn't pay that much attention. But then you had Michael Jackson and MC Hammer, who they just became like mega stars that nobody like saw them. I mean, I don't mean this to be a cut against Michael Jackson, but I mean, they didn't see these guys as black or white. They were just artists.
Celebrities. Yeah.
Yes. And in my opinion, from what I remember, this was really the beginning. I remember whenever Michael Jackson's Thriller was out, I heard one of my aunts on, I won't say which side of the family or whatever, but I heard one of my aunts say, I think he's really good looking. Well, that would not have been acceptable. That was in the early 80s. 10 years earlier, that would have been horrendous for a middle-aged white woman to say that a 20-year-old black man is good looking or sexy or whatever. Okay. But now we're at that point where it's okay to acknowledge this. And anyway, but like even what's popular, the fact that black music now rose to higher levels of popularity, I think is also indicative of we're finally starting to see a little bit of integration in society. And yet we know that that's not the case across the board. And maybe you know.
Well, yeah. So there's like a culturally whitewashed version of integration through the music, and this sort of segues into my time period, because in the 90s and late 80s, but early 90s is when you start to get the first black music that is popular, that is made explicitly about the black experience. That is, Marvin Gaye's album is sort of a landmark in this field, but it's not incendiary the way that like Straight Outta Compton is incendiary.
And I'm looking forward to hearing about that, because in the 80s, we had Prince. So this is another thing that I find kind of interesting. So in the middle to late 80s, the popularity of, say, Prince, the Culture Club with Boy George. I like the song Karma Chameleon, especially like with the use of a harmonica and stuff. But these guys weren't worried. And this is much different than, say, like your heavy metal groups where, you know, the guys may have long hair, but they're still trying to look a little macho, you know, sleeveless shirts or whatever, you know.
Spandex pants. Yeah, very macho.
Yeah, you know, or Kiss, you know, wearing the platform shoes or whatever. But no, you know, so Prince, you know, his puffy ruffled shirts and it's just kind of a mixture of masculine and feminine.
Yeah, he's following in the footsteps of Bowie, who did the androgynous thing. Is famous as like one of the first, like, is that a guy or a girl sort of aesthetic to him, and a very queer aesthetic even in the 60s, like with the music video for Life on Mars. He's in full makeup. He's got his hair done in a very like neither masculine nor feminine way.
Yeah, but
you also have Elton John, obviously, who's famous for his flamboyant outfits, and
that's true. But see, here's the thing: in the 70s, and I even could show you clips from like All in the Family where Archie is saying they're British, see, and the British. Oh, everybody knows the British have always. Yeah, they're not masculine and tough like we are. That, you know, they carry umbrellas and stand around with their hands on their hips.
It is noticeable that the first three like sort of queer icons of the music industry are all British.
Yes. Am I mistaken? But Prince was American, right?
Let me fact check it for you.
Fact check that for me quickly. But I think Prince. Now, I think Boy George might have been British.
Yeah, he's American.
Prince is?
Prince is American.
Yeah. I think the Culture Club.
I don't know if Prince is like quite the queer icon, because that sort of aesthetic was a little bit more common by the time Prince comes around.
That's true. Yeah, and I'm not suggesting, I'm just saying that it becomes more popular for like, people became a little more accepting of men dressing in ways that were more flamboyant, which, like when I was a kid, like it was frowned upon for men to wear pink shirts, for Pete's sake. It's like, I remember even whenever I was a pastor, and I went to district conference one year, and I was wearing a pink shirt and tie, and the district superintendent was an older gentleman. I mean, I love the guy, but he's like, takes a real man to wear pink, you know. And it's like, okay, so sorry that makes you uncomfortable. It's like, I don't, whatever.
Well, you know, I grew out my hair when I was doing my master's degree. I got comments from people in the church about, are you a hippie or are you girly now? It's like, I just have long hair, guys. What year is it?
Yeah. Nice hair, Isaac. It's very pretty.
Yeah, I literally that though.
Oh my. Yeah. So yeah, this is my end of the 80s. But does this kind of bring you into starting with the 90s here on our next episode?
And I'll sort of like tow us in a little bit, but we'll talk about this in the next episode.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The 90s are sort of a reaction against the like overproduction of music. At least the early 90s are like a hard swing in the other direction of less polish, less production, more raw emoting of the music. And that's like especially true with Nirvana. And then you also have at the same time the growth of hip hop as a popular genre. Now hip hop goes back to like the mid 70s in New York, but as its own like musical establishment, it really starts with NWA.
Okay. Now, one thing I did not talk about, and maybe there'll be a place for this will be appropriate, but in terms of analyzing music, in terms of cultural change, one part of the 80s, and this will be the last thing I'll deal with here, but I'll just mention it, is the use of electronics. Synthesizers. This is what starts a shift, and now we have this is the beginning of where we're doing less and less by hand, and allowing computers or like chips or whatever to do these things for us. So instead of people playing live instruments, you end up with more and more. Not completely, but that's also a part of cultural shift.
Yeah. Well, I think
that'll make a nice contrast. Okay. So like with the the millennials and Gen Z, I think your generations are more, like my generation, we would rather kind of do it the hard way, because that's what we were used to. But anyway, we can maybe get into that as you're talking about some of these changes.
Yeah, part of the patterns of the 90s through the 2020s is that there's a tension between, like at the early 90s, you get Nirvana, which is like pretty raw,
right,
in terms of its production and its use of instrumentation. The late 90s, you get a lot more like heavily produced pop into the early 2000s with like the rise of boy bands and pop idols. And then you get like the hipster movement, which is then away from the synthesizer stuff and then into the new like modern era, which is incorporating like dubstep. And there's a lot of cultural influence from like Korea and Latin America now in our pop music. And we'll talk about that in the next episode.
Well, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. I really am. So I think, is this a good place to draw it down? I think it is. So we will continue this in our next episode. And Isaac's going to take us through the 90s, the aughts, and the teens. And then I'll respond and we'll kind of put it together and then try to understand the generations a little bit, not too much because we still are going to go through film as well, because that'll also open up some more overt discussions, I think, with themes and the way characters are portrayed and the plots and things like that. So we can get into a lot of interesting stuff. But our goal is mutual understanding, and whenever Isaac is going through this, we also, part of our analysis will then be understanding how have the older generations responded to the changes that have come since we were in our heyday. And that'll be a good place to stop. So we've enjoyed this with you. And unless the world ends before we get back, you will hear us again. And we will continue our analysis from the 90s on up closer to the present. We hope you have a great day. Again, reach out to us at thehappycynics@gmail.com. And we look forward to being with you again very soon. Take care.